Hello all, Mindy Jones here. My presentation is entitled The Unbinding of Baldwin. I decided to go with a theme. Since I have a partner this week, I didn't want to have a lot of overlap. So let's talk a little bit about this. Unbinding. So an overview of theme would be to set a person free from bonds, to restore personal liberty, having no binding force, invalid, loosening, or dissolving. So I'd like to take credit for this theme, but I can't because it actually ties into my scholarly article, which is entitled Unbinding the Subject, James Baldwin on the Evil That Is in the World. It is by Miko Tyene. I Google pronounced that, so I know that's the way we say that. But he begins this essay with Richard Wright addressing a group of Pan-Africanists in London in 1949. Now, I did not know what a Pan-Africanist was, so I looked it up and I provided the definition here in case you as well do not know. But it is the idea that peoples of African descent have common interest and should be unified. So during this speech, Wright urges what Benedict Anderson calls, and I quote, a secular transformation of fatality into continuity, contingency into meaning, lest the fascists get there first. Now, although Baldwin is one of the first commentators to have picked up on the problem of fascism in Native Son, he sees Wright's solution there as flawed, and he elaborates on this in Everybody's Protest novel, which we know started the beef between Baldwin and Wright. Then Tyene shifts from that in the speech, and he begins to explore Baldwin's question of how are we to disentangle ourselves from the death pact in which the oppressed and the oppressor are bound together. So Tyene furthers that both Wright and Baldwin deploy the idiom of unbinding to explore the conditions of relatedness, or the connections between love, hate, life, death, and its relationship to love's relationship and death's relationship to sex. Tyene argues this is where both Richards and Baldwin insert themselves into a long tradition of Western thought. Plato, Spinoza, Freud, all of these guys who utilize the term of binding to indicate an ontological drive towards cohesion and unity, and a force that I think a lot of these thinkers will deem as love, which is often linked to sex, which we see in Go Tell It on the Mountain with John's fear of his sexual feelings towards older boys, as well as Gabriel's temptation and fall with Esther. So here we have the importance of such undoing by sex. Its threat and promise is indicated by the repetition of Isaiah 6:5 as the epigraph to the novel's concluding part, the threshing floor, which, can we just take a moment and talk about how trippy that section of this novel was? Like, it was crazy pants. Yet the question of binding and undoing are here reconfigured. The undoing at stake is not Gabriel's, but John's. And if you look over here on the left, I put Isaiah 6:5, woe is me, for I am lost, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips, for my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. So, we have this idea of how love, sex is linked to religion. And for Baldwin, the idea, and for John as well, this idea that their queerness was in direct conflict with their religion. For Baldwin, present-day homosexuality is a mode of unbinding from bonds of obligation, those bonds of religion. A flight that, while enabling transformations, turns deadly because it fails to achieve a durable form. So, yet while love is often designated a force of binding, for Baldwin, it must first experience an undoing or an unbinding or a loosening. Because like we see with John, John has two paths. He can either untether his homosexuality, his identity, and commit to God, or he must untether himself from God and thus live his truth and live freely. However, in Everybody's Protest novel, Baldwin insists that after an individual goes through an unbinding, a shedding of a part of his identity, that they must rebind, and that this is necessary for emergence and sustenance. Binding saves a being from the void by cohesion to others, and it kind of reminds me of the idea of queer individuals creating a new family. So this idea of cohesion with others. Tyne's focus in this particular essay, he talks about Everybody's Protest novel, Go Tell It on the Mountain, and he moves into another country, but I'm just going to focus on Go Tell It on the Mountain for my purposes. At the very beginning of this novel, we see John escape into the cinema. And he sees this female character, and she's described as nothing tamed or broke her, nothing touched her. Her refusal of all effective debts. We see that she's neither moved by kindness, nor scorn, nor hatred, nor love. She's just this sort of untouchable creature. And Tyne suggests that this character was presented by Baldwin to symbolize the possibility of opting out of the tight regime that is symbolized by his stepfather's house, by God's house, the idea of religion. And John imagines that this woman had never thought of prayer. It was unimaginable that she would ever bend her knees and come crawling along a dusty floor to anybody's altar, weeping for forgiveness. And we see John do that later in the novel. So the idea that that would not have to occur would be very liberating. To quote Tyne in reference to John, he says that like many a queer kid before and after him, he identifies with the liberatory rage in this female character. And that for the most part, these characters, like this woman, are told as cautionary tales, and she ends poorly. But they also brim with the energy that could possibly allow, as Tyne writes, the freak to self-eject before his complete annihilation by the family. And we see that in John's case. His father, is trying to, in a lot of sense, annihilate him. Tyne then points to earlier drafts of Go Tell It on the Mountain when the novel was called Congo Square. And in these abandoned drafts, the protagonist actually goes and sees Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which I think is even more symbolic and representative of an individual trying to unbind aspects of their identity. And I think, especially for Baldwin and John, they both long to bind or knit their queerness to themselves. But there was that struggle. Morality and responsibility for the elders to pass on religion and God and fear of God is a large theme in Go Tell It on the Mountain. We see that Gabriel has a responsibility to bequeath his offspring these moral schemas. However, tied in with these religious ideas are that blackness is corruptible, and that it's dirty and flawed. And even at that one point where it says, in the twinkling of an eye in which the rapture occurs, would be transcended. So I think this idea that blackness was corruption, John longed to unbind himself from that as well, but then that would be an unbinding from his religion and what his father and the elders and the saints have taught him in church. So this legacy of self-hate, hate of the body, is one that Baldwin and John strive to loosen themselves from. Additionally, Gabriel, we see him trying to loosen himself from his own sexual desires. He marries Deborah. He thinks in a lot of ways that she will save him from himself, that he will be impervious to the temptations of the unclean people, which we see goes horribly awry when Esther saunters upon the stage. But in the end, Tyne concludes that the major theme of Go Tell It on the Mountain is transformation, and that Baldwin is really stressing that we must be released from ourselves in order to become ourselves. In Pentecostalism and all that jazz, Field makes a lot of really nice arguments where, when we talk about Baldwin here in 2024, we have the opportunity with cultural theory that we are able to unbind Baldwin from labels such as being exclusively gay or black or expatriate or activist, but rather he is allowed to be examined as an amalgamation of all these things. And that even though most critics will hyperfixate on Baldwin's style being sermon-like cadence or the usage of religious expression as a structural device for theme, for the most part, Field wants to stress that perhaps it was more than just religious expression as a structural device for theme, and that he's really trying to work things out. Field firmly states that his stance in this essay is that Baldwin's works, though they're frequently critical of black and white Christianity, that they're basically preoccupied with the idea of developing a personal spirituality. And this spirituality would be a way for Baldwin to transcend or free himself from these negative aspects of his identity, and how the church will acknowledge that spirit, even though the church may not acknowledge it, but that the spirit can be found through the communion of friends and lovers, through playing, listening to music, that these things are just as experiences that are as close to God as crawling across the floor to the altar, if you will. As we move on, I noticed as I read To Crush a Serpent, I want to bring this guy in here real quick, but in the Field piece, he talks a lot about how white Christianity demonizes the black body, and we see that a lot in Go Tell It in the Mountain as well, and also the Tyene piece. But I think Baldwin's novels are always cognizant of a certain level of self-hatred, and with this idea of self and identity, that really the church, Baldwin states, the church is how we forged our identities. It was the foundation of deciding and figuring out who we were. And I think in a lot of ways Baldwin had a lifelong struggle to unbind himself from the church's stance that the black body was corruptible, and that's something that he struggled with. And we see here race and religion has been remarked or fearfully entangled in the guts of this nation so profoundly that to speak of one is to conjure up the other. One cannot speak of sin without referring to blackness, and blackness stalks our history and our street. But sin is no respecter of skin. Sin stains the soul. And I think that's really incredibly sad. But Field ends this piece with a discussion on love. Love's a freeing agent, that it's not sentimental, which we've argued a lot about that term, sentimental, but instead means something active, something more like a fire, something that can change you. And in an essence, that love is ultimately the biggest and most powerful unbinding force. And here in this quote from To Crush a Spirit, salvation is not precipitated by the terror of being consumed in hell. This terror itself places one in hell. Salvation is preceded by the recognition of sin, by conviction, by repentance. Sin is not limited to carnal activity, nor are the sins of the flesh the most crucial or reverberating of our sins. Salvation is not flight from the wrath of God. It is accepting and reciprocating the love of God. And I love that. And then at the end is the beginning of union with all that is or has been or will ever be. So I think that's really lovely. For my pedagogical application, this is the beginning of a lesson plan I have taught entitled by James Baldwin, and now I find and am full of shame that I have not done it justice in my presentation, so I promise to do better. But this is the origins, this is the beginning of something. I'd like to further develop this as my final project. You guys can look at it, see what you think. I really love incorporating modern with the older generation of artists, because I think that my kiddos can kind of identify with things a little more. So y'all can have a peek at that and tell me what you think. And then this is a question for specific feedback. I would really like to add a female poet into this little mix. I try to be really thoughtful of all genders and ethnicities and all of these things when I'm doing these pieces. I thought about Anne Sexton, her kind, because I really love Anne Sexton, and she's very confessional like Baldwin. Or I could just do good old Emily Dickinson's I'm Nobody, Who Are You, which is always, which is good. I think that would work, but I don't know. None of them are like jamming. So if anybody has another idea, that would be great. Now, this question, y'all, I go hard. So personally, especially after doing this presentation, I've often wondered how much of what I've been taught in my youth and adolescence, whether it be religious, political, and or social, have I had to dismantle or unbind to become the human I aspire to be. So here I kind of talk about, have you guys ever thought about this? Do you feel like we are able to untether ourselves from our earliest the earliest lessons that we were taught in our foundations, or is it just something that we're just stuck with and we have to struggle with? As Baldwin novels his struggles, is it only the artist who is able to do this? I don't know. I just think it's really interesting. And then lastly, I've noticed that my high schoolers are far more inclusive and open to alternative lifestyles, concepts of gender than my Gen X counterparts. So I wonder if this inclusivity and this movement to being more accepting, I wonder if this will lead to less unbinding in the future, if you will. I'll let y'all read that. But thank you so much for listening to my long-winded presentation. Here are my works cited. But thank you guys so much. All right, we'll see ya.